The low sun was filtering through a tree that created a spotlight effect, and the small opening in the tree reduced the intensity enough for her to look into the sun's direction without squinting. To have that kind of spotlight effect, look for sun filtering through trees like this. I'll show another example, but a bit more subtle. The sun was filtering through a tree branch, but because there was a wind blowing the branch, I had to time it perfectly to catch the spotlight effect that I wanted. Here I mistimed it, but I caught it perfectly here. Working with spotty sunlight can be tricky. I had to position her so that the sun was relatively even on her face, but because her skirt was much brighter than her black top, I had to make sure that the skirt was in shade. We'll talk later about separation lighting, but I had to place a reflector near that trailer behind her to shine sunlight back to her. This separates her black top from the black trailer. For this one, I wasn't sure if I'd like that strong of a sunspot light. So I had her lean out of the sun for another shot. As you can see, there's a tremendous difference between the two, and her head positions were only a few feet apart. I spotted this sliver of light hitting the chair. So, if your subject can handle bright light, use that sliver of sunlight to sculpt the face. And you can have them move around a little bit to see where the sunlight falls on the face, and just experiment. You'll find this kind of high contrast sliver light more prevalent indoors than outside. Same basic technique outside, and we had high contrast here because we were in a dark alley. We can use small sunlit spots in the background too. Years ago, I was at an art museum and I was struck by some of the sunspots on the ground that the painter added. Now, sunspots in a dark, shady area could be a problem for photography. But anyway, that made an impression on me, and I've been able to incorporate that in a few photographs over the years. So in 1996, and yes, you can tell it's 1996 by my shorts, I photographed a girl using sunspots. I also used a reflector just out of camera view, reflecting some sunlight back to her face. The easiest way to handle sunlight spots on the ground is to keep the sun to the subject's back. With her being lit by enough open skylight and the sunlight being reduced after filtering through holes in the trees, this density range could be photographed as is. I had to darken the sunspots in this photograph to make them less distracting. I saw that the splotchy sunlight was hitting the chain link fence and also some things in the background, and that could be interesting. So I placed the subject in an area where she was covered completely by shade. That's the safer thing to do. The less safe and riskier thing to do is to put the person in the sunlight where there'd be some splotchy sunlight and shadows going across them. As long as the face is well illuminated, it's not as important for the rest of the body. I spotted the splotchy sunspots and shade on this garage door and thought it could be an interesting pattern. And by placing her in just the right spot, we got a nice effect, but you have to be careful that it illuminates the subject properly. I mentioned that working with spotty sunlight can be risky, especially if the sunlight hits the front of the subject. There's very little room for error with its sharp lighting patches and high contrast. The sunlight here overlit her chest, and there's an ugly shadow across her face. But having her change her posture to find better lighting on her face, and a breeze blowing the trees, changed the lighting enough to make it better. However, it's still not as good as it should be. We'll usually need to make some tweaks to the image with raw tools or Photoshop to make it better. That's just the nature of working with wild light that's so uncontrollable. So you can usually expect to do some fixing in Photoshop. I think the sunlight patches on the grass matching the shape of her glasses actually makes this photograph. I'll cover a few other things we can do with unmodified sunlight. High sunlight, too much in the middle of the day, can cause ugly lighting with deep shadows, and it usually makes the subject squint.
One easy fix for it is for the subject to wear sunglasses.
We don't want to overuse sunglasses, of course, but they can be useful once or twice in a session.
The visor on this guy's helmet eliminated any concern about the sunlight.
We all know that hard sunlight is brutal, but one way to work with it is to keep the subject far from the camera. Then the lighting on the face becomes less critical and more attention is diverted to the whole scene.
We normally wouldn't want squinting like this, but we couldn't see it on the full view of the image. Here's another situation where the sun was harder than I wanted it to be, and I knew that this wouldn't be the most creative solution to shooting in direct sunlight. But by using a camera modified to record infrared light, it worked. Infrared cameras need hard sunlight. Because the sun is strong, the subjects will either squint, or have to close their eyes, or turn their faces away from the sun, or wear sunglasses.
Now we'll turn our attention, literally, from using the sun at our backs to using it behind the subject. Another way to handle sunlight is simply turn the subject's back to the sun. Keep in mind that unless there's some kind of reflector to kick the sunlight back to the subject's face, the light will be somewhat flat.
The road provided the bounce-back lighting for her face. When someone's moving, it's harder to use a reflector or other stationary devices, so it helps to have a large surface like the light-toned road. It's a popular thing these days to place someone out in a field and use the existing light only. And that's what I did. But I had to work a long time to make this even presentable. It would have been much easier just to use a small off-camera flash. Mosquitoes were eating her up and wouldn't give me enough time to set up a reflector, so I had to settle for shooting it as is. Then relying on Photoshop actions to take care of the rest. I like the final result, but I don't like having to spend so much time at the computer to fix lighting problems.